All right, everyone. Hope you're doing well. So we just looked at the Tuskegee experiments, as well as the Nuremberg trials, and in the Tuskegee, we saw that even after the fact, the medical research that they had done on whether the transmission of syphilis was different between different populations of people, later researchers concluded that the evidence was bunk, null, and void. Right. But now we turn to the Jewish chronic disease hospital case, where even though the experiments were decided in the end to be highly unethical, the research that they got from it was very sound, similar to much of the unethical research gained from the Nazis in World War II. And so I'm going to try to go through this as fast as possible. There's Chester Sutherland himself. There's a bunch of key takeaways, some of which there's at least one that's stripped of his medical license for 1 year. That wasn't actually the case in the background. So I'm going to read through most of this because I think it really illustrates kind of how the game is played and the treatment of whistleblowers. So this is from page 712 in this edition. So, during the summer of 1963, Chester M. Sutherland and DeGracio Custodio together injected live, cultured cancer cells into the bodies of 22 debilitated patients at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. Custodio, Filipino-born unlicensed medical resident, was participating in a medical experiment designed by Sutherland, a distinguished physician researcher at the Sloan Kettering Institute for Cancer Research, an attending physician at Memorial Hospital in New York City, and an associate professor of medicine at the Cornell University Medical College. The purpose of the research was to determine whether the previously established immune deficiency of cancer patients was caused by their cancer or alternatively by their debilitated condition. Sutherland thus looked to a group of non-cancerous, highly debilitated elderly patients who might bear out his guiding hypothesis that cancer, not old age, was the cause of the previously witnessed immune deficiency. Importantly, he believed on the basis of long experience that the injection of cultured cancer cells posed no risk to these patients, and that all of the cells would eventually be rejected by their immune system. Although his professional credentials were impeccable, although his work was deemed by his peers to be of the utmost scientific importance, the experiment soon erupted in major public controversy, comparisons to the Nazis, etc., etc. So, what happened? Beginning in 1954, Sutherland had performed numerous studies on more than 300 cancer patients at Memorial Hospital and on hundreds of healthy prison volunteers at the Ohio State Penitentiary. Surprisingly enough, the prisoners gave consent because they thought that they had a duty to repay to society. Wait till you see the kind of consent he gets from these elderly, debilitated, many of them senile individuals. He had chosen cultured cancer cells for these experiments because they produced the necessary uniformity, reproducibility, comparability, and growth potential to cause a measurable reaction in patients. So here's what it came down to. In the immune system of healthy volunteers, it would normally reject such foreign tissue, aka this cancer, completely in 4 to 6 weeks, whereas it took the cancer patients much longer, like 12 weeks, to finally reject the injected cells. So, was the delayed immune system in cancer patients due to their cancer, or was it due instead to the fact that most of these patients were elderly, debilitated, and chronically ill? So, in order to fill in this gap in knowledge, he decided to repeat it on a group of non-cancerous but elderly and debilitated patients. He hypothesized that this study population would reject the injected material at the same rate as normal healthy volunteers. And he thought this research would go on to produce great things for people down the road. So, y'all following? He wants to inject some elderly people and see if it leaves their body in 4 to 6 weeks or if it's longer, and, thus further science in this effort. To test his hypothesis, Sutherland contacted Emanuel Mandel, who was then director of the Department of Medicine at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital case. Eager to affiliate his modest hospital with the work of a famous doctor at a prestigious medical institution, Mandel immediately agreed to provide the requisite number of chronically ill patients for Sutherland's study. Like many of the studies criticized in Henry Breacher's famous whistleblowing expose. This project was to be funded by the eminently respectable sources, including the American Cancer Society and the U.S. Public Health Service. Sound familiar? Everywhere. At their first meeting to discuss the study, Southam explained to Mandel that his proposal was not related to the care and treatment of patients, that it was, in other words, a pure example of non-therapeutic research. Make sure you get therapeutic and non-therapeutic clear. Non-therapeutic research done not for the therapy of the patient. When they're injecting cancer cells in, it's just to further how cancer works in a debilitated body. It's not to help the patients, right? Whereas a therapeutic experiment would be something done to like test an experimental drug for a patient's benefit, right? Oh yeah, love this. Southam also informed Mandel that it would not be necessary to obtain the written informed consent of patients, since these immunological studies had become routine at Memorial Hospital. He also noted that there was no need to inform these elderly patients that the injected material consisted of live cultured cancer cells, because that would be of no consequence to them. Yeah, I hope you didn't blink there. On the basis of his considerable prior experience of such studies with patients and prisoners, which easily included more than 600 subjects, Southern was convinced that the injection of cultured cancer cells from another person posed no discernible risk of transmitting cancer. In his opinion, it would simply be a question of when, not whether, such injected cells would eventually be rejected by the patient's immune system. Since in his view the subjects would not be placed at risk by his study, Southam saw no need to inform them specifically that cancer cells would be injected in their body. The whole point of using cancer cells had to do with their special properties. No one was actually at risk of getting cancer. He opined. That was his opinion. Prior to investigating the study, Mandel hit a snag. He had asked 3 young staff physicians at the hospital to help with the injections of live cancer cells into the hospital's debilitated patients. All 3 had refused to cooperate on the ground that, in their view, informed consent could not be obtained from the potential subjects that Mandel and Southam had in mind for the study. Oh, is that a fact? I wonder if they had a sense of Nuremberg. Southam and Mandel forged ahead, eventually settling upon the unlicensed and comparatively vulnerable house officer Custodio to help with the injections. How lovely. And so, they initiated the study. Custodio and Mandel had already selected the 2 chronically ill patients to be asked to participate. Asked to participate. Amazing. Southam demonstrated the injection procedure on the first 3 patients, and then Custodio proceeded to inject the remaining 19 with 2 separate doses of tissue cultured cells. According to Southam and Custodio, each patient was told that the injections were being given to test their immune capacity. There was no mention of research, and the small nodule would likely form at the site of the injections, but would eventually disappear. In the investigators' view, this constituted sufficient oral consent to participate in the study. At the end of just 2 hours, 22 elderly and debilitated patients on 6 floors of 2 separate hospital buildings had received injections, and this first crucial phase of the research was complete. With the passage of a few weeks, Southam's hypothesis would be fully vindicated, with the exception of patients who had died shortly after receiving their injections. All of the patients rejected the foreign tissue as completely and at the same rate as the prior group of physically healthy individuals. The gap in the data was thus filled. It was cancer, not debilitation and chronic illness, that was responsible for the impaired immune reaction to Southern's patients. None of the patients, moreover, experienced any lasting physical harms attributable to the study. So all is well that ends well, right? If science is furthered, who cares if they knew it was cancer injected in them? They got out. Well, that's kind of how people viewed it for a hot minute. So, news spread, and the chief of medicine, Samuel Rosenfeld, makes a big deal about it. 3 physicians who refused, Kagan, Fursko, and Leichter, they, fearing that their silence might be construed as condoning the research, resigned in block less than 6 weeks after the injection. All 3 were Jewish. Leichter was a Holocaust survivor, and the other 2 had lost many family members to Nazi violence during the catastrophe of World War II. Each subsequently attributed his negative response to the study to a visceral revulsion at the thought of using such debilitated and helpless patients in experiments without their consent. None had had any training in ethics or law during their medical studies, unlike you fine folks. And Kagan subsequently admitted that none of them had even heard of the Nuremberg Code, which is an interesting thing. I question it, but so basically, this is their motivation for right. In ethics, some of these theories they say that the motive matters, not just the outcome or the nature of the action itself. So, in order to quiet the gathering storm, the hospital assembles the grievance committee. After hearing testimony, the committee judges that the resignations of these three, what I would consider brave, courageous physicians, were irresponsible and therefore should be accepted by the hospital. The committee then fully and enthusiastically endorsed the scientific and medical importance of Southern's research and concluded that the allegations of the three young doctors and of the medical director Rosenfeld against Mandel and Southern were baseless. Later that month, the directors approved the report, and 4 months later, the research committee approved the continuation of the study, but only on condition that he obtained the written consent of all subjects in the study. So that's fine footwork, right? They're like, nothing's wrong, nothing's wrong. The people who refuse are irresponsible. Maybe we should get written consent as well as oral consent, right? A cynical person would take that and make bread with it. I don't think that's an expression. So, what comes next? Eventually, they get William Hyman, a guy who helped found the hospital and sat on the board, and he thinks they're covering it up and pushes and pushes and pushes. And so he gets the minutes of the grievance committee they had looking for irregularities. And in the end, he gets them to re-look at the issue. The grievance committee focused on two major issues the second time around, and these were the assessment of risk and the quality of informed consent. And so that now we get to look at how Southern was viewing the risk assessment and the level of informed consent necessary. With regard to the presence or absence of risk in this study, Southern argued that the injection of cultured cancer cells from an extraneous source into the human body posed no discernible risk. His 10 years of prior experience with more than 600 subjects, including cancer patients at Memorial Hospital in New York City and healthy prison volunteers, had led him to conclude that it is biologically and medically impossible to induce cancer by this means. Excuse me. The regents concurred. As reported in the New York Times, the regents established to their own satisfaction that prior to the study, medical opinion was unanimous that the patients were running no risk of contracting cancer and hence not be cautioned that there was any such risk. Medical opinion at the time was not, however, entirely unanimous on the question of risk, as is hardly ever on any question worthy of public debate. So, we go into it. Another reason to doubt Southern's unequivocal denial of any risk in this experiment is the fact that in one of his own previous studies, the injected cancer cells had migrated 10 inches up the arm of a subject from the injection site to a nearby lymph node. The patient in question had died shortly thereafter, but there was some speculation at the time that, had the patient lived, cancer cells that had migrated that far might have been subsequently disseminated through the body via the lymphatic system. Although Southern claimed that the cells would not have traveled beyond the lymph node if the patient had lived, he admitted that he could not settle the matter with a statement based on fact. Oh, I love the jargon and legalese. But perhaps the most telling and unintentionally humorous admission that Southern made regarding the possibility of risk came during his cross-examination. While emphasizing Southern's confidence that there was no theoretical likelihood that the injections of live cancer cells would cause cancer, the article also noted Southern's unwillingness to inject himself or his colleagues. Collin then quoted the following line from the interview. But, let's face it, there are relatively few skilled cancer researchers, and it seems stupid to take even a little risk. So this is Southern being like, there's no risk, but I wouldn't take it. I mean, there's a little risk, and there's only a couple of us good cancer researchers. Southern responded, I deny the quote. I'm sure I didn't say, let's face it. In retrospect, we can grant Southern the objective truth of the proposition that these cancer cells pose zero appreciable risk to the residents. But we can also question his assertion that any right-minded physician at the time would have corroborated this claim. This doubt, plus his own admission that the injections pose little risk, which some suggest at least some risk, leads me to conclude that the doctor was being somewhat disingenuous and misleading in his outright denials of risk. Yeah, I suppose he might be. So then the other issue the grievance court looks at is like what level of informed consent is necessary and what are consistent and pursuant to like the professional norms at the time, right? Like 100 years ago, paternalism was super common, right? And so if Southern can say, I was doing what all doctors do these days, right? I was consistent with the general practices. Um, at the top of 717, in the clinical setting, truthful information regarding risks was regarded less as an ethical or legal matter and more as a matter of therapeutics. If the risks were small, physicians would likely conclude that the informed consent was not necessary, especially if they believed that the information in question would upset or depress the patients. We've heard this line before. But if the risks were great, or if the physicians needed the patient to be informed in order to better collaborate on recovery, then information would be medically indicated. According to this paternalistic physician ethic, information regarding risks was viewed as essentially one more tool in the physician's black bag. Truth telling was a matter of individual physician discretion, and the relevant yardstick for disclosure was the perceived benefit or harm of disclosing information bearing on the patient's medical condition. So this is stage disclosure 101, right? Against the backdrop of this professional practice, Southern's duties seem clear. The risk of injecting cancer cells into the bodies of frail elderly patients was, in his view, infinitesimally small, perhaps even non-existent, though he wouldn't get it. Were he to announce to these patients that he was about to inject them with live cancer cells, such a disclosure would have advanced no legitimate medical purpose, while only serving to make the elderly residents very upset and anxious. In those days, physicians tended to avoid the dreaded word cancer when talking to their patients, preferring instead to speak cryptically of nodes, cysts, or growths. It was standard medical practice to envelope patients in conspiracy of silence in order to shield them from information that was perceived to be harming, depressing, or otherwise alarming, depressing, or otherwise harmful. So, since the word cancer was irrelevant to the actual state of affairs, since there was little to no risk, and since the dreaded word would only serve needlessly to alarm patients, Southern believed disclosure of the cell's derivation to be medically contraindicated. Oh, I urge you to go read these sentences over and over. Southern believed disclosure of the cell's derivation to be medically contraindicated. To say where these cells came from, that they're cancer cells, oh yeah, love it. In reaching this conclusion, he insisted he was merely acting in the best tradition of responsible clinical practice. It is important to note that the notion of medical relevance here by Southern was purposely objective and scientific rather than subjective. And the arbiter of what counts as medically relevant, objective information was, in his view, the physician who just happens to be the researcher, not the individual patient subject. So, just like in the story of Glaucon, you knew I would take it back to Plato before this course was over. uh, when Socrates talks about how these evil men will have clubs. If anyone gets caught, they'll have people who come out and speak on their behalf. This happens time and time again. So his paternalistic view of researcher obligations was confirmed by a parade of distinguished witnesses on his behalf before the tribunal, high-ranking medical officers and practitioners at such prestigious colleges and institutions as Memorial Hospital, Cornell, West Virginia Medical Center, and on and on and on, all expressed their complete agreement with Southern's central contentions, specifically that his research was of high scientific and social merit, and that there was no appreciable risk to subjects, that informed consent was a matter for individual physician discretion, that disclosure of information should be titrated according to the level of risk posed by research, that the word cancer was generally avoided so as not to upset patients, and would not in any case accurately and objectively represent the true nature of the injected materials, and finally that Southern's conduct towards the subjects was in complete conformity with the prevailing standards of medical practice. So, journalists get in on this, dismissing the controversy as a mere brouhaha. It would be a shame if a squabble over who told what to whom should destroy a thrilling lead in cancer research. Oh, yes. So, the trial board looks at two charges of informed consent. One, the competency of the subjects and the extent of information disclosure. So, 22 subjects, a couple of these like little insides on who these subjects were. None of the residents were told the purpose of the injections or that they were about to participate in a research project that had nothing to do with their own health and well-being. Each was told, however, that they were about to receive an injection designed to test their immune capacity and that soon a nodule would form that would go away in a short time. First question of whether these debilitated elderly patients were competent to not of sound mind. The evidence was clearly mixed. One of them was a 67-year-old patient with poor cerebration who had been in a depressive state for a year. Another was a 63-year-old patient with advanced Parkinson's disease, low mentality, and lack of insight and judgment. Another had a history of depressive psychosis and had been diagnosed as suffering from dementia praecox and unsound judgment. Another recorded diagnosis of post-encephalitic Parkinson's, difficulty in communicating, constant falling, suicidal ideation, and considerable sedation through the years. While it's at least theoretically conceivable that each one of these debilitated patients was lucid during their brief interview with Custodio. Under such conditions, these debilitated patients could not possibly have understood such complex matters in a mere 1 to 5 minutes. Oh, do you think so? However, the regents eventually reasoned that in order for consent to be valid, it had to be informed. And for consent to be adequately informed, subjects had to understand that they were being asked to participate in a non-therapeutic research. For all these patients knew, the good doctors in white coats were merely running routine tests on their immune systems. They had every reason to think about the nature of the impending injections was entirely therapeutic and had nothing to do with research. A mere signature, mere verbal assent, or worse yet, the resigned nod of a confused patient's head were not enough. In the regent's judgment, deliberate non-disclosure of the material fact that the injections were done for research purposes is no different from deliberate misrepresentation of the fact. They conclude that such misrepresentation constituted a serious deception and fraud perpetrated upon the subjects. So, later on, Sutherland's arguing, that it was contraindicated to say the word cancer, and then he was like doing it for the benefit of the patients. And the regent's note, Sutherland may well have professed a concern to shield these patients from any undue emotional distress during these times when doctors often shielded patients from bad news, particularly about cancer. But they were not his patients. He was essentially an interloper at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital who had never previously met the 22 injected residents, let alone had a long-standing professional relationship with them. The regents concluded that at least with regard to the kind of non-therapeutic research involved at the hospital, Sutherland, Custodio, and Mandel were acting primarily as researchers, who also just happened to be physicians. They thus had no right to help themselves to the wide-ranging discretion normally allowed at the time to physicians charged with pursuing the best interests of their patients. Very interesting take. So, in the end, both physicians were guilty of fraud, deceit, and unprofessional conduct in the practice of medicine. They had allowed their zeal for research to override the basic rights and immunities of a human person. Having rendered their judgment, the regents then considered the nature and severity of the punishment. 15 of the 17 voted for censure and reprimand, while the remaining 2 members, apparently believing that being dragged before the tribunal was punishment enough, voted for no further action. In the final action in this case, the board voted to suspend the medical licenses of both Southam and Mandel for 1 year, a stinging rebuke, especially to Southam, who was at the time a grandee of the New York and national communities of cancer researchers. Oh, how rough for him. The regents softened this punishment considerably, however, by staying the license suspensions on the condition that the physicians stayed out of trouble for the next year, during which time they would remain on probation. So he didn't even get his license suspended in the end. Do you see how many times the bad guys, there's just no accountability, no one gets charged with anything. In fact, the people who should be raised up They get charged. So in the denouement, the resolution, you might say, remember the three physicians who were, up on it early on? Two of the three courageous young residents who had refused to cooperate were rewarded for their efforts with exclusion. That means you're getting kicked out of the American College of Physicians. As Preminger reports, their exclusion was doubtless prompted by their refusal to cooperate in the experiment and their subsequent irresponsible resignations from the staff of the hospital. They appealed, and their exclusion was eventually reversed on the ground that their overreaction to Southern's experiments was excusable in light of their family's Holocaust situations. So clock this well. This is some trippy stuff right here. These all too rare profiles in courage were thus trivialized by the governors of the American College of Physicians, reduced to the status of merely exculpatory psychological pathology. The three dissenters had refused to cooperate in wrongdoing, apparently not because of any allegiance to an ethical principle or the basic rights of the human person, but rather because Mandel's proposal had triggered their memories of the Holocaust, which in turn caused their irresponsible behavior. So they're trying to make light of the motivation and saying it wasn't out of principle, it was out of like emotional reaction. And because they were irrational, we'll accept them back. I mean, can you just process what's going on there? Shameful. But the most remarkable historical irony was reserved for Southern himself, having been publicly humiliated by an inquisition before the Board of Regents, having been found guilty of fraud, deceit, and unprofessional conduct of medicine, and having his medical license suspended and placed on probation as some lowbrow scoundrel. Chester M. Southern was elected president of the American Association for Cancer Research in 1968. There you have it, one more time. And if you know, in Madison in the 60s and 70s, we had Henry Harlow, who was experimenting on monkeys, basically keeping them in isolation, shocking them, killing them, and doing lobotomies. And it got shut down as unethical experiments. And he, too, a year or two later, was elected president of like the American Psychological Association or something. So sadly, the good guys often get away. So, it was a bit long, but good work, everyone, and I will see you on the other side.